I didn't want to leave Del Monte, so I turned down the airline job. And then in '72, I got hooked up with Stan, and we investigated hundreds of Bigfoot and UFO sightings since then.
Well, here was the same question I asked you before. In all of the, let's say specifically the Bigfoot cases that you investigated, what would be the most significant case?
Well, the most outstanding case in my mind was the one down at near Uniontown, a little place called West Lysing Ring. This was a case where there was a big UFO in the ground and two Bigfoot at the same time, which is very unusual.
Could you tell us that story from the beginning?
Yes.
I think
Yes.
right from the first time
Yes.
you got the phone call from Stan.
Okay. This was around the end of October. All the leaves had fallen in the ground and everything was real dry. And I went to bed one night. I was working in Pittsburgh in construction work. And about 11 o'clock or 11:30, Stan called my wife and said, we have a Bigfoot sighting down in Uniontown. He said, I think it's going to be a good one. He asked me if I wanted to go, and she hollered up, and I said, no, I don't think I want to go. The longer I laid there in bed, I thought, well, maybe I'm going to miss something. I better go. So we all had CB radios in our vehicles. So I got up and got dressed and went into Greensburg and picked up one of the other members in Greensburg. And we all met down at the Laurel Mall outside of Connellsville, between Connellsville and Uniontown. And the person that had this sighting was down there waiting on us. We had to sit there till his father came home. He was a truck driver. So we waited there a while, and I asked Stephen about I says, how big was this object on your farm? Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. Stephen and two boys that lived up the road a piece were coming home about dusk down to the farmhouse one evening, and they saw this big ball of red light coming down out of the sky. And Stephen said, it looks like that thing is going to land on my dad's farm. And that's where they were headed. So they went on down to the farm, and we stopped at the house, and he went in the house and got his army rifle and grabbed a handful of old army shells that he had there. And they got in the truck and drove out through the pasture field to see if they could see this object. And as they come up over this little grade, here was this big object, either sitting on the ground or hovering right over the ground, right above the ground. I said, well, how big was this object? And he says, oh, from the corner of that store up to that parking light or the street light. I figured, well, it must have been about 150 feet. And I said, was it that big? And he said, well, I think so. And he said it was so bright, it was just like a big ball of light. And he said it was so bright, all the cows were standing around the outside. They wouldn't go near it. And he said, I think you could have read a newspaper, and it was so bright. So when they got out of the truck, they walked up through the field a little bit, and there was a fence up above them. While they're standing there, one of these boys said to Stephen, what's that coming down along the fence? And Stephen said, I looked up and I couldn't see too good, and he said, it looked like a bear to me. As they got closer, it was two Bigfoot. He said one was 8 or 9 feet tall, and the other one was about a foot shorter. He says, I know how tall he was because my dad and I built a fence out of little railroad ties. By that time, they were only about 75 feet from them, and the two boys were hollering for Stephen to shoot. So he says, I fired one shot, and he said it was a tracer bullet, military tracer bullet. He said, I saw it going over its head. He shot a couple more times. There was a couple tracer bullets. The next shot, he said, I shot right into the one, biggest one. And he said it went, ah! And they just, at that instant, the big ball of light just went out, just like snapping off a light bulb. And the two Bigfoot turned around and started strolling back towards where they came from. Well, they took off, and Stephen went down to the house and called the state police, and a state trooper came out. They got in his cruiser, and instead of them going out to the pasture field the way Stephen and the two boys went, he went up around the other way in the pasture field, and they walked down towards where this object was sitting. By that time, the object had left, but there was a glowing, luminescent ring the size of the object hovering right on the ground, about 3-4 feet high. And that, he said that it was so bright that you could read a newspaper in it. And I said to the policeman, I said, when you saw this, was it real bright? He said, well, I shined my flashlight in it and I couldn't see the light from the flashlight. He said, yeah. He said, if I got down on my knees, he said, I think I could have read a newspaper in it. So the cows were still all standing around the outside, so they started walking up along the fence. I mean, Stephen and I and Stan and his father started walking up along the fence where these Bigfoot left. And where Stephen shot at this, the one that crashed into the fence, I'm on one side of his dad, and Stephen is in the middle, and his dad was on the other side. He was a big guy. He weighed about 240. We're walking along the fence, and I said to him, I said, where did this Bigfoot crash into this fence? I thought maybe we could get some air samples. And he didn't answer me. And I looked over at him, and he was rubbing his head. And I asked him again, I said, where did this Bigfoot crash into the fence? He still didn't answer me, and I looked over, and then he started to sway a little bit, and I said to his dad, better get him, grab a hold of him, something's wrong. About that time, he flung us both aside, and he turned around, and he growled like an animal. And this is when he let out those two screams that it made the hair stand up in the back of your neck, I'll tell you. I never heard two screams like that in my life. And I think this is where the dog ran behind us whimpering. He took after the dog, his own dog, and the dog came behind us whimpering. I had my tape recorder running, and Stan had his running. We have all this on tape, both of us. And then we went down a little piece further, and all at once he just crashed into the ground, passed out into the ground. And I said right away to his dad, I said, did this ever happen before? Immediately I'm thinking of maybe demonic possession or something. And he said, no. He says, tell him when he gets up, that when he gets conscious, that he tripped and fell over a limb. I thought this was kind of odd, and I still never figured that out, why his dad made these excuses for him. I think something had happened before that his dad didn't tell us. But when he came to, he was a different person altogether. He was talking in a different voice. He was talking about the world, the destruction, the terrible destruction of the world, and going on and on. And he says the people that are able to prevent it are here. And about that time, I looked down, and one of the guys that was with us was down on his knees, and I said, what's wrong? He says, I don't know. He says, I got dizzy, and he says, I have a hard time breathing. And But another guy started to go down on his knees, and he says, I feel dizzy too, and I'm having a hard time breathing. Well, about that time, out of the woods came this big whiff of what I call brimstone. You know, wooden matches, kitchen matches. Sometimes you'd strike one that wouldn't light into a flame, just make smoke. You know that smell. That's what I call brimstone. That big wave came out of the woods, and I'm thinking, this thing, this Bigfoot or whatever it is, can release some kind of gas to take over our minds. We got to get out of here. He wouldn't let us out. He wanted to go down in that woods and fight that thing. And he wouldn't let us. We had to go through a little electric gate, electric fence. He wouldn't let us go. He wanted to get down in the woods. We had a terrible time trying to prevent him from going down in the woods to fight this thing. Finally, he agreed that we could go. So we started out towards the truck. We had the truck still parked down in the field. And I'm in the back. And he had his, when he came to, he had his hands clenched like this, you know. And I'm walking with him in the back. I had a carbide lamp with me, and the rest of the guys had flashlights. And partway to the truck, he fell down on his knees, and I'm trying to help him up. And I looked, his hands were still like this, and I tried to straighten his fingers out with it. They were like steel. I couldn't even bend them. But finally, we got him up, got him down to the truck. We got him down to the house, and then we left him there, and we came home. Well, the next night, Stan and I went back to the farmhouse to interview him again. And when we went in the kitchen, I noticed on the kitchen table there was one magazine. That's the only magazine I saw in the house. I think the title was Pennsylvania Farmer, or some kind of a farm magazine. And while we were interviewing him, I said, is there any connection between those two Bigfoot and that UFO? And he started into this, the psychiatrist called it a fugue. And he started talking crazy, and Stan and I was hollering at him, trying to get him out of this, which we did finally. Well, then after we talked a little bit more, we decided to come home, and we walked out on the back porch, and he was with us, and he said, I'll never forget it. He said, these things are forming all over the world. Now, there wasn't anything on radio or television much at that time about Bigfoot, and I knew he hadn't read anything because the only magazine I could see was its Pennsylvania Farmer, and he wasn't too smart. I don't know how he knew that these things were gathering all over the world, which proved to be true. Well, Stan had a friend, Dr. Schwartz, from New Jersey. He was a brainwave specialist. He lectured at 4 or 5 hospitals up there, and he was really interested in the UFO field and Bigfoot. He left his business for a week and came back down here, stayed here for a week, and went around and interviewed all the people that we had talked to, the state policeman and the 2 boys and Stefan's dad and Stefan. And he told us not to go back and to interview Stefan anymore. We might do him some harm mentally. After this happened to Stefan, he had all kind of psychic experiences. Really weird things happened to him. He saw his wife's dad. He was at her house one day, and he said this man came walking up the hall and went into a back bedroom, and he said to his wife, who was that guy that just came through here? And his wife said, I don't know, what did he look like? And he described him, and she said, where'd he go? He said he went in that bedroom there. It was her husband. He had been dead for, her father, he had been dead for a number of years. And one night he drove truck, and he had one night it was in the wintertime, and he was out in the front of his house under a street light there in the street where he had his truck parked. He was putting antifreeze in the truck, and while he was working there, he said he heard this cat meow. He looked down, he said there was a black cat standing there, and he didn't pay much attention to it. And a little bit later, he said, boy, there's a louder meow, and he looked down, and that cat was about twice as big. The third time, he says, boy, he says, I mean, it really let out a meow. He looked down, there was a black panther. He had a pistol in his pocket. He pulled it out and took a couple shots at it. They went running up the road, and he's shooting at it, and it disappeared. The next day, he was out there doing something with his truck, and there was a woman lived right there in an apartment right above him. She said, I was watching you last night there changing your antifreeze or fixing your antifreeze. And Stefan said, did you see that black cat? She said, no, I didn't see it. He said, did you hear me shooting? No. Did you see that black cat? No, she didn't see any black cat. And then one other time, he was working on his truck, and he had a friend there with him, and a big blue jay landed on a telephone line right across from him, and he said to his friend, he said, if I hold my hand out there, that blue jay will come over and land on my hand. His buddy said, you crazy or what? George says, or Stefan says, okay, watch. He held his hand out. That blue jay flew down from the telephone line, landed on the top of the cab of his truck. George had his hands on the hood. He jumped down off the cab of his truck onto his hand, stood there on his hand. All kind of things like that had been happening to him. They had all kind of weird stuff happen on the adjoining farm with UFOs, and it was a weird setup for years after that. And finally,
were most of the cases a single Bigfoot reported? I know there were multiple. Was that a rarity, or was that more common that you'd see two or more of them together?
Stan had some reports down around Keystone Lake, which isn't very far from here, of some of them swimming in the lake. I think there was some little ones connected with that, wasn't there, Stan?
Yeah.
Down at the lake.
There was a couple, well, there was one report of two of them swimming under the water.
And, of course, the two down at the Uniontown case. Most cases were single, but there were some cases where they were multiple.
And of all the hundreds of cases, do we have even a single report where the Bigfoot harmed a human being?
I personally don't know of any. I don't know whether Stan does or not, but I don't know of any.
The witness testimony, when a human encounters a Bigfoot, does the Bigfoot remain in position, move away from the human, move toward the human?
Most of the time they move away. Most of the time they get away. But there's been cases where they stayed there. Like this one woman I told you that she shot it with her shotgun. She lived in a little cottage above, you know where Ohio Pile is? Mm-hmm. She lived up on top of the mountain. It's a pretty rugged country up there. She lived, a little lane went up along the edge of the woods, and she had a little cottage up there, just a little piece in off the road. Her husband was dead. She was an old mountaineer lady. She used to go trapping with her husband. He was a trapper. And she worked at Uniontown for a while after her husband died. She'd come home in the bus and get off at Chalk Hill, if you know where Chalk Hill is, and walk across to where she lived. Now that's a couple miles at midnight, at night. And she said a lot of nights the bobcat would follow her. But anyway, she said she had a box of tin cans and stuff from the garbage on her little, I call it a stoop. It's just a little 6x8 platform with a little roof over outside her back kitchen door. She had it sitting out there, and she said there was some wild dogs came around there and would get into that, and she heard them one night rattling the tin can, so she went and got the shotgun and put a shell in there. It was either a 16 or a 20 gauge, and she thought, well, I'll open the door and I'll snap on the light and open the door real fast and shoot. She said, I didn't want to try to hit the dog, but she said I wanted to scare it. She said when I snapped the light on and flung the door out, a Bigfoot was standing there right at there's a railing around the porch. It wasn't more than, I jumped 8 feet away from a big UFO, a big Bigfoot. She said it raised its hands up. She said I thought it was going to jump on me. She said I shot it right in the chest with a shotgun. That's when she said there was a big flash of light and it was gone.
It just disappeared.
Just disappeared. Next day, Stan and I went down there to interview her, and I sighted across from where she said she shot. It was right at the edge of the woods, and there was a pretty good size, a tree about that size there, about 20 or 30 feet away. I went over and looked, and boy, that tree was all peppered with BBs about chest high. So she had shot at something. But there were a lot of sightings there at that one particular spot with her and her son-in-law. Her son-in-law lived right down below her in a house trailer. And she said several nights a UFO had come over. She didn't call it a UFO. She didn't know what it was. She said this red light would come over her cabin and hang there and blink off and on for a while. And this one night, after she shot at that dog, her son-in-law came up to see what was going on, and he said it was 3 or 4 Bigfoot running around there at the edge of the woods, and he shot at several of them. When he came home from work that night, they had a little shed built there. They had a horse, and he says every night when he'd come home, it'd be after dark, and he said I'd feed the horse, and he said the horse couldn't wait till I got home and go in there and eat his feed. And he said this one particular night, when that Bigfoot was there, the horse wouldn't go in the shed, And he said when he came up, when he heard this, when he came up, he tried to call his mother-in-law, and she wouldn't answer. She wouldn't answer the phone. And he said, I knew she was there. So he walked up. When he got up there, she opened the window right along the road, the driveway there. And he said, why didn't you answer the phone? She said it didn't ring. And he said, he told her about how many times he called. At that time, while he was talking to her, he said he looked down over the woods. There was a hollow went down there. And there was a red light hanging down there over the trees, blinking off and on, off and on. So she had more than one experience with UFOs, but she didn't know what they were. She didn't know anything about UFOs at that time. And she said she had rabbits there, and about that time when she shot at this Bigfoot, one of the rabbits was missing, but the door of the rabbit pen wasn't unlocked. It wasn't opened. So whether something took the rabbit out and relocked it, had a pin in it, repinned the door or what, I don't know. She didn't know either. So that's why I say I don't think they'll ever catch one, because it has the ability to dematerialize. I think if we'd have questioned her, she'd have felt some heat when she felt that light. Because I think when it dematerialized, it changed back into energy, light and heat. She saw the light, but I don't think she felt any heat.
After that flap in 73, 74, people continued to report Bigfoot, but just not at the numbers from 73, 74.
Not as many,
That's
no.
what Stan's been telling me.
There was still a lot, but not anything like in 73 and 74. 73, the phone, we had a guy who did nothing but answer the phone. And we all had two-way radios, and he'd be in touch with us all the time. He was an invalid, and he had a CB set, and we all had radios in our vehicle.
Oh, good. We have a question.
The textbook thing?
Can I ask a
He
question?
has a question. Can you answer
Yeah.
right here for Phil?
George, you mentioned a rabbit was taken from a cage,
Uh-huh.
and Stan had mentioned in the Pennsylvania Dutch area, I think some Bigfoot were seen taking ducks,
Geese or ducks or
geese or
something.
ducks. Is there any indication as to whether they would be carnivores or omnivores?
I don't think they're carnivores. I don't know why I think that, but I don't remember of hearing any reports of anybody seeing any eat meat, but we've had reports of them eating apples and stuff. I think they're more vegetarian than they are carnivore.
So it is kind of an interesting observation that the Bigfoot seem to appear to materialize and dematerialize, and I don't know why it just seems odd to me that they're eating. For some reason, it just almost seems like they're being projected in, and one wouldn't be able to physically pick something up and consume it, but
Yeah,
yet they do.
You're right. I've often wondered about that too, whether they really eat or whether they were just chewing on an apple or something. I don't think anyone that I know of ever seen them really swallowing any food, you know. Although people said, we had reports of people who said they put food out for them and the food would be missing, but who knows what ate the food? Coons or whatever, you know.
And it's also just an interesting observation that I don't know how much study's been done on maybe other known animals that might have been killed by them. That there's no indication that they're out eating or killing or trapping animals.
Well, I only heard of this one case just recently, the last couple of months, of Bigfoot killing a dog. Now, usually, like I said, the dogs are scared to death. And I haven't heard of any reports of them chasing dogs, but I think Stan might have heard a couple. But this one case, I think it was down in Georgia. This one woman and her two children were coming up from someplace through the woods there and at night, and they saw these two eyes up ahead of the road shining, real bright eyes at night. When they got up there, this Bigfoot was standing right in the road, and it wouldn't move. They had to stop the car. It was right in front of the bumper. And the kids were hollering, back up, get around it, get around it. So she said, she finally did back up and drive around it and drove up the road a piece. When they got up there, they drove past it sounded like it was a place where they raised horses. And there was a couple of fellows working there, and she stopped and got out and she said, I'm going to tell you what I saw down there, but you're not going to believe me. The one guy said to the other, he's back. And they told her that a couple nights before, a Bigfoot came there, and the dogs chased it. Now that's the first time I've heard of dogs chasing them. The next morning, one of their big hounds was missing. He said we went out looking for it. We found it out in the woods, not far from where our barn was, dead, wrapped around a tree. So that's the only case I know where they ever chased dogs or where dogs would chase them.
Yeah, not only do we are not hearing about humans being injured, I know Stan was telling a case where a Bigfoot was being observed near a trailer, and I believe it was the people inside the trailer were observing it, and I think they telephoned a neighbor that was also observing it. But it was also known that where the Bigfoot was, within just not too many feet, there were some children that were sleeping outdoors
Oh yeah, they were sleeping on the porch.
on the porch.
Well, in that case, the Bigfoot was standing right outside. He heard this noise, and he looked out. He had a patio outside his house trailer. That's over in what's the name of that place? Whitney. You know where Whitney is?
Sure.
Lakeshore Airport.
Yeah, he lived in a house trailer right there at this end of Whitney. And there was this great Bigfoot standing right outside the door. He said he had a outside floodlight. He said I was afraid to turn it on. He said as big as that thing was, it looked like it could upset the trailer. And I think he said it. I think it hit the trailer, but he watched and it went up across the lawn. That's where the kids were sleeping on the back porch of a house, adjoining house. It went up across the lawn and up in towards the woods. Well, they called the police. There was how many cars came out? That 3 cars.
Yeah.
6 troopers came
Yeah.
out there. This was
Early morning.
this was
Labor Day morning.
Labor Day morning. Labor Day evening, they were sitting around there and talking, and what was it? What was his name?
Chester.
Chester says, "Come on, Bigfoot." They were talking about Bigfoot. He says, "Come on, Bigfoot, I want to see you." That's the night. That morning,
That's the morning they saw it.
And when the police came out, they were checking it. They said they could see the tracks going up through the dewy grass where it went up across the lawn. Stan and I went down the next morning, and Chester discovered a big dent in above the door of the trailer where it hit it with its fist or something, and there was still lawn clippings on the patio, the concrete patio outside the trailer where it come off its wet feet.
George, would that be an indicator that they might be able to understand the human language? He asked to see Bigfoot, and then he did get a chance to see Bigfoot.
Well, like I said, I think they're psychic. They might be able to get some kind of a
More of a telepathic type of thing?
telepathic message out of it. I don't know.
You, why no Bigfoot bodies have ever been recovered? How would you answer that?
Because they're psychic. I don't think they'll ever recover any. They can dematerialize, and how are they going to find them?
Any other questions?
You may want to ask a little bit about Kecksburg. His theory on the Kecksburg object, you said, for down the road.
Yeah, we're all familiar here with the Kecksburg crash from December 9, 1965, and do you have a theory on that case?
Well, I recently got a new theory on it, just the last couple months. I was listening to Coast to Coast. They told about when the Roswell crash happened. There was one happened about the same time, not very far away, 20, 40, 50 miles away, in a smaller craft. It was only about 12 feet long and about 6 feet in diameter. There was 3 aliens in it. 2 of them were dead when they got there, and 1 was still walking around. The rumors are that we kept that one that was living for a year or 2 before it died. But when they mentioned this craft, 12 feet long and 6 feet in diameter, not slightly damaged, immediately I'm thinking of the Kecksburg object, which
Similar shape and size.
except that it was an acorn shape. This one was an acorn shape, but the one in Kecksburg wasn't damaged at all. And the guy on Coast to Coast called it an escape pod. So that got me thinking, an escape pod. My theory is that a UFO that night was coming down someplace from Canada, and something happened. They knew it was going to crash, probably in the Allegheny Forest up there, which is an enormous forest. There could be a half a dozen crash in there, and they'd never find them. I think it released this escape pod. That's what came down to Kecksburg. Every incident that I can think of regarding that Kecksburg case, I can fit into it being an escape pod. I think before they crashed, they released this escape pod. It had partial control. They had it built extra strong because they knew it had to make a crash landing. They wanted to protect the occupants. Well, we know it had partial control because it made a big turn down around the base of the mountain there, Laurelville. came up and crashed at Kicksburg. And they were in such a hurry to get that thing out of there. They couldn't get it out of there fast enough. In fact, while it was in the ground there, some guy stood up on top of it, and he had a stick of some kind. He wrapped it with his stick, and a little portal on the front opened, and a long, skinny, rubbery arm stuck out, and then pulled it back in, and the portal snapped shut. They knew there was an occupant or two inside of there. They were trying to get it out of there as fast as they could to get it someplace where they could open it up and get this occupant out, or the two, whatever was in there. Because we had reports of two boys standing up along the road there when the truck left with the object on the back covered with a tarp. And he said it was going so fast, he said that you better not be in front of it, it would have ran over you. They were in such a hurry. I think they were hurrying to get back to either Pittsburgh or get it over out to Wright-Patterson to open it up and get the occupant out of there. Everything seemed to fit as an escape pod rather than a UFO. If it would have been a UFO, don't you think it would have been really damaged? Look at the one at Roswell. It's scattered over almost a mile and a couple hundred yards wide. And the next one, that escape pod that landed there, was hardly damaged. And the one at Kecksburg didn't even have a dent in it. It was made extra strong to make a crash landing. And I think that the UFO came looking for it that night. They may have found where it was. If you remember, it was drizzling. It was drizzling that night a little bit. And it was dark by that time, with all the police and everybody around. There could have been a UFO hovering up there at low ceiling because it was drizzling. They wouldn't have had any light on. They wouldn't have been making any sound. They could have been up there watching the whole affair, but they couldn't come down and rescue the occupant. That's my theory, latest theory on it, and I think it had to be an escape pod. I don't think it was a UFO by any means. It was a UFO, but as an escape pod.
As far as what style it was, whether it was a...
What you're saying is it wasn't Earth-made, it was from somewhere else, but it wasn't the actual craft itself. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it wasn't the regular UFO per se. It was a special built part of the UFO as an escape pod to get out in case you knew a crash was coming. You could get in this escape pod and make your crash landing and survive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions? Or anybody?
Yeah, I do.
One more question.
Do you have any theory as to why there's UFO sightings in certain locations? If they would be drawn to that area, or is it always just crash landings?
No, we used to think they were seen mostly over power lines and lakes. I've kind of given up on all those theories. You can see them any place. One thing I heard about a couple months ago, which I never heard of before, that one that landed, or that hovered over a Hare Airport out in Chicago, was there for, I don't know how long it was there, but hundreds of people watched it hovering over the airport. When it left, it made a hole through the clouds. The hole remained there. Now,